Okay. Welcome everyone to our program of Artist Talks at the Maine College of Art and Design. I am Kyle Patno, the series coordinator. And on behalf of the college, I would like to thank our sponsors at the Madeline B. Cohen Visiting Artist Endowment Fund, established by the Jean R. Cohen Charitable Foundation. Their continued generosity supports our endeavor to deliver these invaluable dialogues to the public and campus community. It is our mission to provide dynamic engagement between diverse voices of young and established creatives currently working in art, craft, design, and areas of cultural production. Additionally, contributing toward an amplification of Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ voices at the college. Tonight, we are also partnering with the ICA at Maine College of Art and Design to present the panel discussion, Transforming Surveillance, as part of the recently opened exhibition, Monitor, Surveillance, Data, and the New Panoptic. A few notes before we begin. Our speakers tonight will have their screens pinned for ease of viewing the panel, and the audience will remain muted until the conclusion of their discussion, at which point we will open up for questions. We will monitor the Zoom audience throughout, and should you wish to participate, please click on the reactions button at the lower right corner of your Zoom screen and select raise hand to be recognized. And as always, if you do not wish to participate through video, we will always read your questions out loud through the chat feature. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Julie Prospect-Santos, the director of the ICA.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. The panel discussion is offered in conjunction, as Kyle noted, with the new exhibition in the ICA at Maine College of Art and Design, Monitor, Surveillance, Data, and the New Panoptic. The exhibition exhibits the work of 8 artists who explore the ways in which our lives are being influenced and determined by visible and invisible actions of watching over. The artworks reflect on the prevalence of surveillance in contemporary contexts, as well as its historical antecedents. 4 of the artists or artist collaborations join us this evening. The exhibition is accompanied by an extensive series of artist talks, discussions, and a film series, and is part of Freedom in Captivity, a statewide coalition-based public humanities initiative to explore and promote abolitionist visions and organizing in Maine during the fall of 2021. Many of the events are virtual. Please do check our website for more information. I'm going to start with brief introductions to our panelists this evening, and then I'll hand it off to the moderator. Our moderator tonight is Brendan McQuade. He's an assistant professor in the criminology department at the University of Southern Maine and author of Pacifying the Homeland, Intelligence, Fusion, and Mass Supervision from the University of California Press in 2019. In addition to his academic writings, he has published commentaries in The Appeal, the Bangor Daily News, Counterpunch, Jacobin, and the Portland Press Herald. He is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and on the advisory board of the Visionary Organizing Lab. Our panelists this evening include Ann Messner, a New York-based multidisciplinary artist. Her work has examined fault lines between the individual and the larger social body as encountered within public realm discourse, investigating the incongruities between notions of private life or space and public and civic engagement and experience. Her work has been exhibited at Franklin Furnace, Nina Felshin, Dorsky Curatorial Projects, Cucifrito's Gallery, and University Museum of Contemporary Art at UMass Amherst. Anne is a recipient of numerous fellowships, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, Anonymous Was a Woman Award, the NEA, and a Gottlieb Foundation Fellowship. She was a fellow at Radcliffe Institute at Harvard and at Princeton University Council on the Humanities. She works as a full professor at the MFA at the Pratt Institute. Our second panelist, Christopher Gregory Rivera, is a Puerto Rican photographer based in New York City. His work is particularly interested in rescuing historic narratives through documentary, still life, and archival research to promote a better understanding of the present. He has lectured at the International Center of Photography in New York, and his work is in the permanent collection of the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. He has been shown in the United States, Puerto Rico, and the Netherlands, and is a founding member of Black Box, a visual cooperative that merges the creative processes of photography and design to build immersive stories. Our third artist collaborative this evening is Margaret Lorena Kemp and Abram Stern. Their work in the ICA at Maine College of Art and Design is the third in a series of collaboratively envisioned mediatic dialogues. The work brings together media and metadata, surveillance and witnessing, being overheard and overlooked, hypervisibility and concealment, quantification and abstraction. Margaret Lorena Kemp is an actor, a multidisciplinary performing artist, writer, and director whose research explores authorship and spatial politics through performance. She has performed widely, and her experimental performance films and durational performances have been installed at Woman Made Gallery in Chicago and Elaine Jacobs Gallery in Detroit. She's a professor of theater and dance at the University of California, Davis. Abram Stern is an artist and scholar whose practice engages techniques of opacity and intelligibility within collections of government-produced media and metadata related to surveillance, militarized policing, carceral systems, and their oversight. His artworks and collaborations have been exhibited at New Langton Arts, the Beale Center for Art and Technology, and Real Artways. Abram is a PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz. And our last artist partnership is the collective Orphan Drift. Orphan Drift has explored the boundaries of machine and human vision since its inception in London in 1994. The collective, as Avatar, has taken diverse forms through the course of its career, changing personnel and artistic strategies in accordance with the changing exigencies of the time. Orphan Drift artists Maggie Roberts and Ranu Mukherjee join us on the panel tonight. Orphan Drift works have been included in exhibitions at Laboratoria Art and Science in Moscow, Telematic Gallery in San Francisco, the IMT Gallery in London, Nottingham Contemporary, De Loire Pavilion and Arnolfini in the UK, the Bernardo Museum in Lisbon, PDX Contemporary in Oregon, and Lomex Gallery in New York. Each panelist will begin with a brief overview of their works in the exhibition, so those of you who haven't had a chance to see the show get an idea of what they're exhibiting. And after that, I'll turn it over to Brendan McQuade, who will moderate the conversation.
I guess that means I go, right? Looks like that. Hi, everybody. So I've been asked to speak for 7 minutes. I'm going to time myself. So my participation in the exhibition is a tabloid, newspapers. You can see them along the floor. This is the 3rd edition, and it's in each edition has been 2,000 copies. The first was distributed through the Pratt Institute Libraries, 2018. The second was distributed through New York City Public Libraries, the Downtown Consortium, another 2,000 copies. And so these 2,000 copies, in addition to being a number of piles, Julie or Kyle, you can just flip through these images. You'll see that, and this edition is being distributed through the main library system. What do? I say next, next, next.
Yes. Sorry, I'm having an issue. 1 second. There
Okay. Okay, you can run through the next. Next. Okay. No, wait. So, back one. Anyway, this is the front page of the tabloid. I think it's 36 pages. It's basically structured as a timeline. And the timeline runs the span from 1833, which was the time of the first tax publicly supported library in the US, which was in New Hampshire, to 2017 with the event of the banning of Freakonomics and Alice Walker's The Color Purple in the Texas state prison system. By the way, they did not ban Mein Kampf. Next. So what I did was I just took a series of snapshots out of the tabloid for people who won't see it. This one and the next one are copies of the FBI files that were made public by a FOIA request. So these are the FBI files of the surveillance of Grove Press, having to do, they were being surveilled on issues of obscenity and sedition. This was in the late 60s. And the files were not made public until 2012 as the result of a FOIA request. Next. Oh, I thought there were two. Well, anyway. Okay, missing one image. So, no, back. Can you go back? Oh. Yeah, okay, on the right. Okay, stop. On the right, just to show the mundane character of the FBI files, the right image is talking about how they went into the bookstore and bought a number of copies published by Grove Press under the auspice of Christmas presents. I mean, first off, these books were being publicly sold. So next. Next. So this is, again, the tabloid is structured as a timeline running linearly. The facts sort of crisscross. There are multiple topics, one of which has to do with issues of obscenity, sedition, and the other interesting topic, which is throughout the history of the Free Library in the US, has to do with segregation. So this is, these photographs are from the, sorry, the 1957 Howell trial, where Lawrence Ferlinghetti, a bookseller, he was the defendant. And so the topic of the file had to do with First Amendment rights. It's the obscenity clause, and the argument was around First Amendment rights and what constitutes redeeming cultural value versus pornography. I will say this was thrown out of court because it was proven that Howell does have redeeming cultural value. You know, I just want to just quickly go through throughout the 1930s, actually the beginning of the 20th, the 1900s into the 60s, there were a series of laws that enacted different forms of censorship. There was the Sedition Act of 1918. There was the 1930 Tariff Act, which had to do with you couldn't mail, you couldn't import or use the US postal system. And then going into the 1950s, there was the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, HUAC. That began in 1938 into the 1950s. So you can see there were these sort of laws along over the years enacted to prevent distribution of material that was considered obscene or seditious, all of which were infractions on our First Amendment rights. So the First Amendment continuously comes up in the history of the library. So I'm trying to talk as fast as I can, but I probably am running out of time. I've got 44 seconds. Okay, next. I'm not going to get through the whole thing. I just want to address one other thing, that the beginning of the public library was the structuring of a library system throughout the US that was segregated. So there were, throughout, beginning in the 50s and 60s, actions to desegregate. And so this image and the following image, please, are taken the following image. I've run out of time, but I just want to finish describing this. Were documentation of the Tougaloo 7, which were students who sat down to read in a whites-only library. They were arrested on the grounds of vagrancy. And you can see that the trial was particularly brutal. And, well, I'm done. I got halfway through my notes, but that's okay. I'm going to put a link to a PDF version of the paper if anyone's interested who can't get a physical copy. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris. First of all, thank you to Julie and Brendan and everybody for having me. So the piece that I presented for the show is one piece from a project called Las Carpetas, which looks at the longest continuous surveillance program by the US government on its own citizens, one of them, if not the longest. And this took place for about 50 years, from the late 30s to the late 80s in Puerto Rico, and was carried out by the FBI and the Puerto Rican Police Department. And it was really done to surveil, intimidate, and criminalize political speech concerning independence, social justice, and environmental justice. The work is really kind of an equal part photographic project and guerrilla kind of archivist project. On the island, because of its colonial context, the interpretation of history is really kind of inherently political. And so this project has a component to it that challenges sort of the official narrative using the state's own archival practice. Let's go to next. So basically, 150,000 people were tracked over those years, but 16,000 of them have extensive files, which popularly are in Puerto Rico are known as las carpetas, which roughly translates to files. And the practice was so prevalent that the word was turned into a verb. So to be foldered or to be filed, to be carpeteado. And even though it was really present since the beginning of the US invasion in Puerto Rico on the island in 1898, the practice was really kind of increased after World War II. The US was under increased pressure to decolonize its territories by the UN and international groups, and groups on the island fought for independence. So, you know, this surveillance practice was a direct kind of counter to that political movement. But really, a lot of what you're going to see in the show and what I'm showing are files that were made during the 1960s as the FBI applied its COINTELPRO program, which was a program aimed at domestic activists in the United States, and basically partnered with the Puerto Rican Police Department to create a secret police specifically created to surveil and suppress these political groups. Let's go to the next slide. From an archival standpoint, what's really interesting about these files is it's the only mass surveillance operation that, when it was decommissioned, was returned to the subjects that were surveilled. And that decision was sort of heralded as a win for sort of transparency and human rights. But what it really did was fragment the archive and fragment the way that we can reconstruct a historical narrative or remember this moment. And as a result, most of these files are in people's homes, in closets, garages, offices, which is not really where you want an archive like this to be stored. All right, and go to the next one. So what's even crazier about these files being returned directly to people, I mean, people would get a letter in the mail saying, hey, we've been watching you for 30 years, come pick up your file. And it was an original, completely unredacted file. And when they picked their files up in the late 80s, early 90s, people found out that the secret police had heavily relied on regular citizens to serve as informants. So as they read their files, they found out that their neighbors, friends, in some cases even family members had been informing on them to the police. In other instances, other undercover agents would infiltrate groups and in some cases even friend and family units to gain their trust for information. And this is particularly important as I kind of start to think about showing the work and making this work, because a lot of these individuals that were involved in this are still alive today, and they live side by side and they run into each other at the grocery store. So the effect that that has on society is really, really pretty deep. I'll pause for a second to talk about this picture because it really is important to understand how the files came to be known and to public light. It's a little hard to see probably on your screen, but this is very typical of these surveillance files. There's numbers written with ballpoint pens on individuals in the image. And there's an individual on the left-hand side that's actually looking straight at the camera and kind of holding his chin. That's Arnaldo Darío Rosado, who was 3 years after this picture was taken, murdered by a group of police officers that had entrapped him, and an undercover agent posing as a member of one of the independence groups convinced him that he was, they were going to carry out an action to blow up a radio tower. And when they got to the radio tower, him and another friend were executed on the spot. The investigation is kind of like a Puerto Rican Watergate, lasted for about 10 years and eventually led to the uncovering of the secret police, which a good analog to try to understand it was very similar to the Stasi in Germany. Next. This is the dorso of that print, and you can see names, but to the point where it was, you can kind of see, I think it's 17, it says, works at the Popular Bank in Atorrey, which is like the city center. They didn't even know his name, but he was like, that's where he works. All right, next. These are objects that were confiscated from people's homes. And it was kind of ironic. One of the police archivists told me that the police's archive of radical leftist books was to be envied because they would confiscate them from people's homes. And go next. Next slide. These are more confiscated objects. And then the last one. Not the last one, but yeah. So, these documents are kind of go beyond, in the way that I work with them, go beyond them being just these objects. In a lot of ways, you can kind of think of them as an encyclopedia of betrayal. And I think the social impact that this had is really what's interested me and what got me interested in the first place, because I started it right after the Snowden revelations, where people would sort of tell me, oh, I don't care if the government's watching me. I have nothing to hide. And the issue is not really that the government is watching you or that you have something to hide. It's the fact that that they're listening to you. And so in Puerto Rico, this particular program was carried out in the name of national security, much like a lot of surveillance. But the purpose of surveillance was not to foil criminal action, but rather to have that state presence felt, and to create social rifts amongst the groups that were advocating for independence mainly. And so, a lot of the work is aiming to sort of repair that fragmentation of the archive by photographing it, documenting it, rescuing a lot of this photographic archive, to sort of create a place for both Puerto Ricans and people around the world to meditate on the broad effects of surveillance and what that does to political speech, especially as it's increasingly undetectable, but also to sort of create a place to untangle that lasting effect on political and personal violence. In Puerto Rico, where for many reasons, especially the colonial context, a process of truth or reconciliation or both is not really possible. And the last slide is the installation.
Thank you, Chris.
Barbara?
Hi, Margaret.
Great. So I think it might be important to note that our collaboration began when we were in a public space looking at material that had been taken from different surveillance or uploaded in different sites as YouTube and shown out of context with their maker. Abram?
Yeah, so this is a 4-hour-long video installation with a decoupled score that we'll hear a little bit of shortly that contains material from a few different sources. There's what you're seeing, which is from a performance that Margaret did at Montalvo Art Center. She can say a little bit about that. There's also material from FBI surveillance of the Baltimore uprising in 2015 that the FBI published a year later, and also aerial surveillance of Minneapolis from last year.
So the performance was about 4.5 hours long, and it took place outside and inside. And I created the performance with the knowledge that people would use their personal devices to document the performance. And the outside portion of this work is in what is called the Italianate Garden. And it's filled with sculptures of, I'll just say, mythical white people, like Romeo and Juliet. And quite coincidentally, I'm also doing my performance in white. The movement score is created from different African American social dances, all linked together and performed in a procession through the Italianate Garden, where people gathered, witnessed, or surveilled my performance for their own use. And then the performance continued inside, where the participating witnesses could look at me through a glass enclosed room. And again, moving through the space with a ritualized movement of soil. Abram?
Sure, next. So this is one of the images from the collection of 18.5 hours of aerial surveillance that the FBI posted. And this is a corpus that I've been working with roughly since they announced it. Their FBI file vault tweeted about this about a week before the 2016 election. And to me, this information, this kind of media becomes really interesting when these public agencies like push them out to the public, and it's in those public interfaces. And the file vault is where the FBI posts the charismatic evidence. So if you file a Freedom of Information Act request, sometimes they'll give you what you ask for, usually not. there's often malicious compliance where you'll ask for like the contents of a floppy disk and they'll send you like a faxed image of the outside of the disk. So when they actually make the decision to post something online in its entirety, it becomes significant. And my approach to this material has been largely to focus on the metadata. I'm interested in the kinds of traces that the institutional and infrastructural and technical apparatus leaves in media. And when the FBI is tweeting about a piece of media, I don't really trust the motive. And so I feel like this collection of media is reproducing a criminalizing and racialized gaze. And so my work has really been to try to separate out those remnants of the apparatus from those images.
And
Next.
I think that mirroring that impulse, my desire is to claim the authorship of my own body or the Black body in space as more than spectacle, as more than a collection of numbers and figures. And it was really interesting to me that I was in my creative journey would return to the people who witnessed the work and said, I would like to have your tapes back because that's actually my story. And in some ways, Abram was doing the same thing with the FBI footage. And we both felt like this was a really interesting and necessary conversation to have with our work together.
Next. And so what we're seeing here is an image that I'm using a process that I'm calling unburning, where there are 2 layers of metadata in this collection, and one of them is on the wall on the right, and we'll see a detail of that in a moment. The other is this sensor data that is written onto the screen. I think we've all experienced like working with a text document that is not a text document. It's just an image of text, right? It's unsearchable. In the same way, these video images contain images of data, right? There's all of this data that the sensor produces, but it's not data in a sense that you can query it. And I wanted to see what it would take to isolate that from what was underneath. And there are these computational image processes that you can use that look at pixels and how they change over time. These are used a lot in other forms of surveillance and motion detection. If a pixel changes a lot, it means maybe your UPS delivery man has gotten close to your Ring doorbell. And so seeing how spaces change over time is a way to measure. These are circling aircraft, they're manned aircraft, they're not drones. And so if the video is constantly circling and the text is standing still, there's this process that tries to separate those things out. Part of that was wanting to interrupt this gaze and not wanting to represent people who'd been captured without their consent. And while I had this sort of aspiration towards a very clean separation, what it produces as it's working is this much more abstract set of images. And so this is the process of it working more than the result.
And in conversation, again, with what I'm feeling in flesh and not as digital, but the flesh having this same kind of relationship almost to the eye, seeing these layers and really starting to question what would it take for these, for the violence that is associated with a racialized body to be unburned from the language, the digital language, the historical language, the the lack of a place that is truly public and private, that's the question. What does it take? And in duration, what I'm hoping, particularly in the live performance, is that there is some way of meditating along what you're seeing. Just like in this image that is the FBI footage, when you look at my body in this space, you are sort of tricked to thinking it's a historical body. But really, everything about the body is very contemporary. I have on Nike sneakers, I have on a contemporary clothing, I have dreadlocks. Everything about me is totally now, but most people sort of immediately go into some kind of mythical space of my relationship to time, place, and space.
Next. So this is the stack of the metadata of both the videos that Margaret reclaimed that document her performances and the collection of FBI videos. Next.
I think you could just go to next.
This is some of the footage from the Predator drone that CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, flew over the George Floyd uprising in Minneapolis last year on a very cloudy day. Next.
And that's Romeo and Juliet in the back, in case you're wondering. And those are people documenting my performance.
Next. This is some more of the unburnt process where you can see some of the on-screen data. The disarm text refers to the LiDAR, the light, I don't remember the acronym, but some of these other sections are redacted. That's why we see B7E on the side of the screen, and much of it, that's the redaction exemption code that the FBI claims about why they're protecting their practices and their techniques. Next.
And this is an image, this was from a GoPro surveillance camera within the performance space, where I have been working with the idea of soil as data and attempting to separate it within the performance over time.
Next. This is some of that metadata. I won't read through all of this. This is, if you work in Premiere, you're attaching this to every file you publish. What I will call out is we see B7E white kind of in the middle. And then these are the files that were imported when the FBI was redacting the file. And after B7E white, you see the FAA tail code for the plane that was flying the sensor and a precise time stamp. For the most part, metadata is very much like the banal, it's more haystack than needle, but occasionally you find interesting things in it. And our approach for the score was to treat this as the script, not as a list of facts about the world, but as a text and as something to voice and to connect with the body.
Right. So that when what happens when the human voice starts to shape these symbols on the paper, and what kind of narrative does that create? And on the original video files of the performance, there's another set of language of people that are talking about me, talking about the work. What am I doing in this space? You know, how does this belong in this space? Am I really moving or am I standing still? Lots of different questions about what is happening, which in many ways mirrors what this FBI footage is saying.
Next, and then I think the last slide is just some of the score where you can get a sense of a small fraction of what that element is of the work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Ranu from Orphan Drift. I'm going to speak a little bit about the piece that's in the exhibition, and then Maggie's going to speak, my collaborator, about the work that's sort of coming out of that work. Our piece, called If AI Were Cephalopod, is a channel video installation. It's two projections and two flat screens. And this slide that you're looking at right now is this kind of storyboard for the piece. The work is based on the idea, as a speculative work, about what it would be if an artificial intelligence were developed around the intelligence of and the sort of biological and behavioral tendencies of an octopus. And so it kind of proposes that we think about and other ways of thinking about intelligence through non-human species, and in particular, this species that has a lot of really beguiling qualities, one of which is the way that it, though colorblind, turns colors based on what it is experiencing in its environment. So this is a film that's structured on a set of color fields that represent experiences that the octopus might be having. So this diagram shows how the film moves from white, which is a state of calm or death, to an orangey red, which is a state of curiosity, to deep alizarin blues and purples, which shows anxiety and fear, to this half white, half red courtship thing that the creature actually turns. So half of the body will turn white and half will be red, one half to attract and the other half to repel other potential mates. And then the last part is chroma chatter, which is a sort of flow of color that is really effusive and exuberant and playful, that is sort of linked to the camouflage capacity of this creature. You can go to the next slide. So I'm running through a series of slides, which are actually a bunch of stills that were this photographic series that we're making now, but it's totally based on the installation. And the components of the installation that are really important are the way that the screens connect on the wall to form a sort of a kind of counter geometry and to sort of destabilize figure ground relationships in the work. And then also this text. So this one says, if AI were cephalopod, it would have 3 hearts and see with its skin. And you can keep going through these slides. So the texts are really meant to address the viewer very directly in terms of the speculative proposition, what would happen if AI were cephalopod, and the way that the language works in written form also sort of addresses the viewer itself, because it could just say if I, which means that it's sort of, you're not sure which place you're in relationship to the text. And then there is some sort of sense of, is AI already like this? So it relates to the theme of surveillance in multiple ways, one of which is to provide a sort of alternative definition of intelligence, and also of artificial intelligence, and how, to just sort of pose the position that it could be different than what it is, that what we're doing with it in terms of demographics and just selecting sort of certain biases. And then also this notion of the idea of the unknown, that if AI were cephalopod, we would not presume that we fully understand it. So the idea that we don't actually really know necessarily what it's doing. The piece also brings together a whole bunch of different sort of image modes. So there are sort of computational aesthetics in there, such as LiDAR. There are animations that are based on sort of the movements of the creatures. There is also cinematic work with an actual octopus. Maggie, my collaborator, is lucky enough to live somewhere where she's able to swim with them. And I live near an aquarium where there's a giant Pacific. So the piece in a room is also very much based on the kind of light and the conversation that's happening between the different images. And the two small squares that you see on these screens are flat screens. And so there is like different kinds of imagery there. This piece led us to go into a more actualized version of that, and to actually begin to try to create an AI that learns from a cephalopod. So Maggie's going to talk about that part of the work now, and you can advance the slide. You can keep going through these. These just are going through the different sections of the film. Maggie, you're up. You need to unmute.
Yeah, you missed me saying thanks, Ranu. So yes, next please. Thanks. So we've started a project working with a very open to unusual ideas or thinking out of the box with creative people AI lab called Ethic Lab, based in Wales. And we got the project's called ISCRI, which is Interspecies Communication Research Initiative, but really ISCRI's, we're not thinking of that entire like it's got a name. It's an energy project that's very experimental and in the process of prototyping. So that what you're looking at here is mesocosm, which is the ethical husbandry version of a aquarium tank, but we've done a lot of research on that, what would be a good life for an octopus. And also I've been working with an interspecies communicator with octopuses in the kelp forests around Cape Town during the lockdowns, and she's very serious that one would just interview octopuses to see who would be up for a predator-free year surrounded by screens, which we know octopuses understand as a place of sensory information, because lots of stuff on YouTube, for example, that film Octopus in My House has octopus watching TV. Anyway, so the idea is that it keeps saying the host has spotlighted my video, Julie. I'm not sure what that's, anyway, nothing, okay. Still see the mesocosm picture, yeah. So I know, just go back, thanks. So the idea is to have a mixture of screens and play objects, with interactive possibilities in both media and sculptures, kinetic arms with video on, aren't just in the usual screen frame shape, to see if an octopus will engage with images that are based on, like we thought about how to make art for an octopus would be about pattern and light change, and not representational and not perspectival, and to try and learn without necessarily understanding meaning or what was being communicated. So that's part of the human relationship with this, but the other part of the triangulation is an AI which would be emerging from data sent to it by a lot of sensors around in the tank, which will have the octopus in its environment is what will be being, information will be being gathered on. So it's not just focused on the octopus, it's the octopus in environment, which is conceptually something we're interested in. We're thinking about different ways of evolving AI that is, you know, not surveillance or marketing, but really responding in an uncertain, messy, kind of embodied world somehow. Like there's a huge amount of concept and research gone into the collaboration, which it's 7 minutes can't really address, or what 3 or whatever I've got. But could we have the next slide? So yeah, this one on the left shows, so the octopus in its environment is then being monitored by this whole feedback system, emitters being the artworks and the detectors being the sensors, and then artifacts, the emergent sort of octopus AI. So there's a lot of feedback loops between that we're assuming we won't necessarily know when communication's taking place between the octopus and the AI as it reaches equilibrium, and therefore is making, you know, definite responses to certain kinds of movement or light change. And maybe next slide, please. So so we've been trying to think about what art for an octopus might be. I'm working with a mixture of LiDAR and Blender 3D animation software, and also, next slide please, thinking about how to model distributed consciousness, like something that's seeing, because the octopus has 8 arms with intelligence that's individual in each arm as well as collective as a whole, which is another thing we're really interested in thinking about with AI. And then next slide, please. Yep, so this is just another more liquid version of imagining into that kind of consciousness that's also has a sort of 360-degree perspective, isn't vision-led based sensorium, which so senses we don't know how to process consciously. We may have them, but like chemotactile, huge amount of touch in this fluid environment, in terms of how the octopus processes and learns in its environment. So we're using triggers we see in octopus behavior and biology that could be ways of following on from the if AI piece, ways of imagining or training an AI, like just making parameters based on curiosity and real engagement with environment in a way that's wondering what this could produce, like not having a goal and working into a place of unknown with the future of AI. So next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just some of the kinds of environment in the octopus life world. Next, please. And yeah, so we're really just trying to build things that are pushing towards pattern and not a central focus perspective representational form. We're just at the beginning, and a group of computational artists and Ranu and myself are bringing different kinds of sensibility to the offerings to this creature to see what sorts of things it might be interested in, recognize in some way. But the key thing is we're really not assuming we will have any idea of meaning, and that's an important space we try to adjust to in the Western worldview. Could what happen next, please? Yep, so this is, I think possibly Ranu's has as her background. This is some patterning Ranu's been doing that is from her own work that is be bringing in to the environment, how to animate these kinds of patterns into layers and different dimensions, how these will become animation on some of the screens. Next, please. And been making, this is called the Mimic Skin Reef, and it's trying to work with the originally octopus environment, literal seabed environment, and making it into layers of pattern that can lift off and animate and become really unclear what's figure and ground, which is another sort of counteract of surveillance in a way. Trying to confuse figure ground and being able to know what you're looking at. I think that's something that Orphan Drift's been interested in for many decades, actually, is having no central focus and sort of shivering confusion of layers and elements coming together. So next, please. Yeah, then on that note, been making some things in Blender where the what is surface seems to be interior on this circling orb that constantly shifting, and wondering whether an octopus will find that of interest, because a lot of the kinds of visually stuff in the octopus environment is extremely strange, and it's like everything's moving in the same kind of rhythms of wave motions, ebb and flow, and confusing different kinds of alive is there, and different sorts of massively different textures, and the octopus seems really sensitive to all of this in the way it responds to environment by becoming the environment, quite literally, which is the camouflage you see, which is a mixture of texture and color. And yeah, next please. Yeah, we've been working, one of the artists computation artists we're working with has been using Turing reaction diffusion patterns to try and simulate octopus skin color change and movement patterns across the skin to see if it reacts to that in any way. So I think, and that's a matter of coding. So there's also thinking about using procedural dynamic algorithmic coding to produce just a lot of different possibles to see if the octopus responds to anything. So yeah, keep trying to emphasize the unknown. Really important to us here with this project, that we don't know what we're doing and we don't know what communication may be. Next, please. Again, LIDAR used to try and give some sense visually of the chemotactile complexity of information gathering. Next. Yeah, and then we call this the encounter diagram, because we're thinking of the whole pieces as an encounter between two alien to human kinds of distributed consciousness and the human artists, and then audience later at a later phase in the project, where the AI will be treating audiences in a gallery as if they were, and artworks as if they were octopus in its environment, and to see what that does. So there's also no hierarchy between the three elements. Things are going to be set up very clearly in a way where these things on the left-hand side are words. We're trying to work out language to talk about the project with, are really about a process of becoming, a sense of collaborating with these really different kinds of intelligence together. And what else was the other? Yeah, so traveling across knowledge systems, like really trying to think about many different kinds of approach to the world, from indigenous knowledge to what really sort of really collaborative thinking can achieve, and between science and interspecies communication, for example, like to treat them as equal spaces of knowledge gathering. So that these things underpin the project, and reflect thinking about what could be training AI. Like we're being partnered by the Serpentine Gallery's Creative AI Lab research department in London, and they have a database with a lot of interesting essays and articles and podcasts on. And one of them that I've really enjoyed it's called Indigenous Protocols for Machine Learning. And that kind of thinking, like what would that be? What could that be that rests the current agendas, of machine learning away from the really kind of racist and controlling and surveying system we have at the moment. So yeah, I think that's us. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for, I know, so your projects are all long time practices and durational works, and 7 minutes or 10 minutes is not nearly enough time to begin to convey all of the incredible thought and process that has gone into them. So I thank you for giving us a little taste of your process and introducing folks who haven't been able to see the exhibition into what the works in the show consist of. So I'm really happy to bring Brendan into the conversation to guide a dialogue, a conversation between the artists, and talk about a few different ideas and questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your presentations today, and Julie for the introduction and the opportunity to discuss surveillance with everyone. So I have a question, a general question for all the panelists, which I'm going to follow up with a more specific articulation of that question for each installation or work. So I'll go through all these questions now, and then each panelist will have an opportunity to give their response. And after that, we'll take questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please do type them up in the chat, and we'll take up as many as we have time to discuss. So the title of this panel discussion is Transforming Surveillance. And my general question for all the artists relates to this theme. How does your work help us appreciate surveillance or see it differently? Does the perspective on surveillance contained in your work suggest any possibilities for transforming surveillance? And if so, what might that transformation entail? So for Anne Mesner, I have a question about the product of many surveillance practices, the files. So many of the harms and dangers of surveillance are not manifest in the act of surveillance, but in how the resultant files are used against people. From your work on library surveillance, what have you learned about the potential harm contained within such files? What have you learned about mitigating these harms? And then finally, how can we translate these conclusions that you've drawn from your work that draws mostly on the more labor-intensive surveillance practices of the 20th century to our present moment of automated, ubiquitous, and often suspiciousless digital surveillance? For Christopher Gregory Rivera, I also have a question about the files. So the program you focused on is, as you mentioned, is one of the longest surveillance programs in US history. In an interview for BuzzFeed, you explained its everyday cultural impact, noting that the fact of this surveillance was dinner table conversation. However, as you explained in your presentation today, when the files became public, it was on an individual basis. So there was no process of collective remembering. What do you make of these different impacts? On the one hand, the surveillance had a profound impact on the political culture and everyday life of Puerto Rico. On the other hand, the memory has been suppressed. Of course, this is not just about Puerto Rico. Your work is clearly an effort to bring the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico into a sharper focus. What does this surveillance reveal about this colonial relationship and colonial relationships in general? Does your work raise any questions or possibilities about transforming this relationship and redressing its harms?
Hey,
For
Brendan,
Margaret, yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you, and maybe we could just tackle those first two questions, because I think it gets a little overwhelming with all of them at once. And those two artists are really investigating archives. So maybe Anne could start, and then Chris, if you have something also to answer the question. Those are really amazing, deep questions. So I want to make sure we have time to understand them.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, so I'm not going to time myself this time. I got myself in trouble doing that. Thank you for the questions. And also thank you everybody for your presentations. So again, my project focused on the idea of a free library, and then it went through a timeline of specific events. So, one of the things about the library, the public library, the idea of a free library, is that it encompasses the idea of First Amendment, but also within the history is the struggle for access to knowledge. So when we're thinking in that context around surveillance, surveillance is the interruption of that free access to knowledge. And within the history, there are a series of events that happen, which are very specific, that disclose certain behaviors. And I think with regard to your question is like, what's its effect, right? So again, the site is the public library. You go to the library, you want to research something on communism, but you know that the FBI would have access most likely to the files. And, it's the, where, this whole idea of sedition is in the culture. So, you're intimidated and you don't do your research. I mean, that's like on a personal level that you can see how that would affect you. And I think more recently, with the war on terror, there was, again, this extension of the library awareness program. And, one of the things that happened, so the sort of countering it, which you're asking about, was that over the decades, the librarians who are invested in, for the most part, they're not perfect, but for the most part, they're sort of radical and want the information available to everybody. So over the years, they figured out strategy to counter different forms of suppression. So like the War on Terror, the Library Awareness Program, there was a gag order. So if the FBI had been asking for library records, the librarians weren't supposed to tell anybody. So what they did was serendipitously, they put up signs, if the FBI has been here, we will take the sign away, right? So if the sign was missing, you knew the FBI had been there. But I just think, I was also thinking just the broader impulse of your question, because you refer to paper files, and we have this idea of surveillance as the big brother looking at us. But I was thinking more in the context of today, the type of surveillance that we willingly sign up for in the form of Facebook, Instagram, Amazon, eBay, right? Where we're willingly signing up for a type of economic surveillance. And I think that that, even though it seems sort of benign on the one hand because it's attached to our desires, I choose to make this public, I choose to buy this. But I think ultimately, it's incredibly pernicious that because of our digital reality, everything that 30 years ago we basically did in private. I went shopping, I was the only one who knew I did it. Now it's sort of tracked by Google, Amazon, eBay, whatever. It's just tracked. And so our lives, what used to be private, is basically almost all public now. And I think that with regard to your question, that seems to be the most concerning for me. And again, I'm not talking about the library anymore. So I think, and then specifically, I also really do want to address how the parallel libraries that were formed, which because of the segregated the laws that prevented integration, and it's regional. And, even in the passage of the Civil Rights Act, still there were individual fights that continued. And, where you see that still being played out has to do with small school libraries, small town libraries, where there are, books that are banned. And, when you see those lists of books that are banned, the NCAC, National Coalition Against Censorship, has a list of the most banned books. Things that, depending on who you are, you would think are very interesting, really benign books are actually censored quite regularly across the country. And, when we think about this idea of book burning, we think of the Third Reich or something, but, it's still regular practice in this country that books are taken off reading lists, taking out of school curriculum and are burned. So I guess that's my answer to your multifold question.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, actually, that kind of got me thinking about something that's really interesting that I think about with Las Carpetas, because, when we talk about like what we can learn from this particular archive, for example, is that it's a rare example of having something that's completely unredacted, right? So you're reading the information from the informants. You know who the informants are. You know what their relationships are to the subjects that they were surveilling. There is intelligence reports about why they recruited such and such informant. So the state's gaze about what they're doing is very clear. And I think it's a rare opportunity to see sort of the scaffolding, right, of the surveillance that certainly now, but was always sort of opaque. But I think when we apply it to a contemporary context of, the amount of metadata that private institutions and public institutions have on us, you know, a lot of the information in las carpetas, for example, was private, but the vast majority of it was public discourse. And so it's not so much about the content of the files, which is really what we learned from las carpetas, but rather the act of surveilling, both the effect on the individual of being watched, but more so the fact that that information is collected and can be used, right? And so I think when we think about surveillance in a contemporary context, the fact that that's recorded puts public discourse, political discourse, and privacy at a disadvantage, whether it's being acted on, used, or not, right? I mean, that's why the NSA has huge dragnet operations. Well, let's just get all the metadata. One day we'll need to use it. And when you look at the way that the legal structure is created now with FISA courts, et cetera, well, you can't have particular information, but you can have metadata. And really, that's all you need. That to talk about networks and to talk about communications, because, you know, ideas and political discourse is really done through a network of community. And so if you have the metadata that if you have one piece, you get the rest of it, right? So that's one meditation on I think what's interesting about the specific, like, kind of nitty gritty stuff about las carpetas. But I think in my practice, you know, to your idea of transforming surveillance, I mean, I think what's interesting about me is it's a photographic project, but inherently there's like a performative aspect to it, right? Like these files, it is dinner table conversation, right? As you mentioned, and I kind of said, but like, people don't know exactly what it meant, right? Like I grew up with it. My mom was like, oh, like, don't go to a protest or you're going to get surveilled and filed, you know? But then when I saw the file for the first time, it became very real and very heavy. And there's a history there of a political self-determination, a call for justice, and a history that isn't taught in high school or any school for that matter, unless you go to the University of Puerto Rico and you have certain teachers. And isn't widely known. And so while the fear of the state and the fear of expression and the fear of political determination exists and is pervasive to this day, even though this practice formally ended 30 years ago, that chilling effect is still in practice, right? And I think now is a really interesting time to rescue this narrative, because there are political changes happening in Puerto Rico. And my personal practice is both a conceptual and performative art piece to put on a wall and to start a conversation and to have these types of conversations, but quite literally a rescuing of historical documents that serve sort of as like a Rosetta Stone or a talisman to understand the trauma that and the political issues that are happening in the country today. And I think, you know, more broadly, they can really be applied to a lot of post-colonial or oppressive situations, you know, civil rights movement in the United States, and a lot of other post-colonial situations. South America has a lot of history of surveillance and repression. So that's kind of the interest of it. I think I answered everything. Yeah, I don't know. Well, okay, my last bit on this is, you know, another part of this, which is sort of the next chapter for this project, is to really rescue, to really actually do like archival, like guerrilla archival thing and go to people's homes, which is what I did for this project, look at their documents, do interviews, and rescue it in the efforts to create sort of a broader national archive of this surveillance. More so beyond my own practice is really just for research. And I think in maybe the hopes of a national reckoning, right? Because the political situation in so many post-colonial or colonial contexts, and in Puerto Rico certainly, is its relationship to its colonial power, right? And if we want to have a fair and honest process of self-determination, I think it's important to understand what that relationship was, right? And what it is. So I think that because so much of this history was criminalized, and people from that generation are starting to pass away and hopefully sharing their stories, even though a lot of them struggle with that. We oddly rely on the state's account. And often people who were alive then rely on their own surveillance files to remember things. And so that history is sort of being written now. And I think the files, ironically, for better or for worse, are a big part of how we remember it and how we piece together that history, right? And that relationship to the colonial power, which in this case is the United States.
Well, thank you. So Chris's, answer provides a nice transition to the next question I wanted to ask to Margaret Kemp and Avram Stern. So your work also deals with the files, but in a very contemporary articulation of the problem, which is metadata. So your work is a 4-hour-long video installation and dance performance, and it's hard to take in because of its size. And to me, this seemed to be by design and a commentary on the vastness and opacity of metadata. Metadata is only intelligible to machines. In this way, your work gets at a central paradox of metadata surveillance. Something that is intended to make the world more legible is premised on a technical infrastructure and knowledge that overwhelms the human capacity to absorb information. What's more, it gets at this paradox in relation to criminalization and anti-Blackness, which, according to Afro-pessimists, is incommensurable. So Frank Wilderson claims that the Black radical agenda is terrifying to most people on the left because it emanates from a condition of suffering for which there is no imaginable strategy of redress, no narrative of redemption. In the same piece, he writes that Blacks do not function as political subjects. Instead, our flesh and energies are instrumentalized for other agendas. So I wonder where your work intervenes on these questions. Are you trying to make anti-Black racialization and criminalization more visible or intelligible in some way? Or are you trying to explore and interrogate its, unintelligibility?
Well, I both and I think that that's why when I met Abram and learning more about his work, it seemed to me they spoke stronger together because you do have that relationship between the flesh as an actual body and thinking about the narrative that the flesh holds for me as an individual, as well as the narrative that society puts on the body. I'll let you continue, Abram.
Sure. I think it is partly about making that apparatus visible, but not on its own terms, like using these points where it has a moment of edge, like there's the point where the motor and one of the plane sensors breaks and the camera kind of pans up and it just shows static for 5 minutes. That's usually the only piece that I show people because it's like it's no longer subjecting the population in that moment. And it's not to say like, oh, look, the FBI's technology is very clumsy and like we don't have to worry about it. It's not that at all, but it just feels like this moment of opportunity to say, well, we can also understand that this apparatus is already aesthetic in some ways that can be addressed maybe after the moment of urgency where like the people who can do real forensic analysis have already maybe been able to do their work. The FBI only released this footage after they'd already decided not to charge the BPD in Freddie Gray's death. So I feel like there's other work that can happen kind of in that period after that is more interested in thinking about the poetics that can make this kind of intervention where there's a body that can gaze back, right, and meet the camera. That's it wasn't until I saw that after we did it that I understood it,
Right.
in those terms.
And also speaking about the sound that is detached, that you put on your personal surveillance device. That's what I call the phone. It's a personal, and you can't, while you're in the space of the gallery, it's continuing to play. That it's continuing to have this life well beyond where you think you've left it behind. Right. So they just started this new, you know, upgraded surveillance system in California where they're going to capture your license plate so that no matter where, you know, just no matter where you go, there somebody knows where you are. It so that audio sort of functions like that. It's still there, kind of spewing out this sensation of it's real and it's real flesh, but as you separate it from the experience, how much more do you separate from the experience of in itself?
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're writing metadata all the time, much more than we're reading it. And so like maybe there's an argument to like build some literacy around the kinds of data that we're producing. But I think for artists and media scholars, maybe there's like this other question of like, how do we read it and write it against the grain? I think there's like this, you know, I don't want to say metadata wants to be read in a certain way, but I think there's a disposition to reading it as a list of facts about the world that doesn't need to be the only way that we approach it.
And speaking to what you mentioned, the duration of being able to watch it for that length of time really speaks to asking you to question, what would it feel like if you lived that? If that's your lived experience.
Okay, great, thank you. So finally, for Ranu Mukherjee and Maggie Roberts of Orphan Drift, your work rethinks artificial intelligence through the somatic tendencies of the octopus. Many surveillance systems, like facial recognition technology, for example, and a logarithm or AI matches data against the database. This project does something very different. As you explained, a generative adversarial neural net, learns, allows the AI to learn from its environment. And you drew the parallel to kind of speculative fiction. So writing about the work of Ursula Le Guin, and it's her birthday, by the way, Jasper Burns contends that speculative creative works can show us a future that's not an outgrowth of history, but an overcoming of history. So with this in mind, I wonder like what you might have learned by rethinking AI from the perspective of the plastic, opportunistic, fluid, protean otherness embodied by the octopus. And perhaps it's not an overcoming of history, but an overcoming of human perception. In any case, I wonder what you've taken from this.
I think we're still in the process of this. I mean, like Maggie said, the second project, which is like more actualized, is in the works, and it's really in the sort of development and fundraising stages. But I think this idea of listening to some other creature is very important and I think that that's something that I just feel like if we're going to survive, we all have to do more of. So that's a really big part of this. I mean, I think doing that in lots of different ways. I think that also what Maggie was talking about in the second part with, this idea of a creature who has both individual intelligences in different parts of its body and this kind of central network. The idea of being able to have individual and collective intelligence operating simultaneously feels like what should be happening. And that, but to us, it's like a utopia. So I think that there's just a desire to learn from that. And I'm going to say happy birthday to Ursula.
Also,
Maggie?
yeah, totally. Also, maybe there's an urge to kind of be part of conversation around dismantling the Western colonial Enlightenment worldview with its catastrophic consequences, through thinking about decentering that, entitled and labeling and controlling agenda that's we're such a mess, and looking to, like during COVID as well, like the rise of such an intense form of banal, to take Anne's word, surveillance, in a way, like the intensification of surveillance is massive through COVID, just like, whether you've got your vaccine, countries deciding whether or not to have vaccine passports or what you have access to if you haven't been vaccinated. Like, yeah, here South Africa's very behind, but in the Northern Hemisphere, because the global South obviously wasn't a priority to vaccinate. Actually, I'm just going to not go too far into that, but it's really interesting being somewhere where that's kind of more rogue in a way, surveillance wise. For example, like we all woke up to have this thing saying join this app to be surveyed, to do with COVID, whether you were at home and all that, and everyone just sort of said, excuse my language, to that. Like, whereas everyone I know in my friends in England are on the so-called NHS track and trace app, and I don't know what it's going to be like going back there, because I've been here for the whole weird 2 years of lot of this new kind of surveillance that is absolutely incorporated into our lives, and it's divisive. And so, yeah, another aspect of this thing of individual and collective Randy's talking about would be about community, like building some sense of different kinds of community, and what resistance might be, and what the role of artists have in joining this conversation and contributing to it. I think for us, it felt like a really core, deep question would be that sort of meshes the colonial, trying to help dismantle the colonial thing, is with prioritizing imagination, talking about climate crisis, human centrism, and all this is what is intelligence, what's consciousness, what's knowledge, what's different kinds of knowledge gathering. And yeah, we always worked with fiction and mythology in a way in the past, and the octopus is like a bigger challenge than many of the fictions we've developed, in a way of trying to imagine into this distributed consciousness that, like, it's just a physical, it's an embodied thing that maybe AI can be trained on, instead of these data goals that are really catastrophic at the moment. Yeah, being a bit vague, but that's something.
Well, that's great. Thank you all for your responses. I'm not seeing any questions from the audience, so I wonder if any of the panelists have any questions you'd like to ask each other.
I liked, Margaret, I was really interested in what you were saying about the Earth as data or something. You said something about that. And I think that that's sort of something about also thinking about training this AI on this creature, this other sort of thing that is like way in excess of the way that we think about data. So I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that, how you think about that.
Over the course of the indoors, that gigantic, I don't know, several hundred cubic feet of soil was separated into little clumps across the indoors, thinking about the information, thinking sort of specifically and also metaphorically, that so much of what we're discussing is really rooted in the history of the United States. A lot of our ways of approaching data and keeping count of people and where they are and what they're doing is, bloomed out of the plantation system. So really in the work, meditating on that and pulling it apart while others are doing essentially the same thing while they're watching the body in the space. And I have a similar question over to Anne, because a lot of this work has to do with public and private. And when you were talking about the public and private and the history of banned books, I'm often inspired by The Bluest Eye and its relationship to soil in the way that Toni Morrison creates the narrative. And that book has been banned as early as 2021 in California. So these, the sort of robbing of the language and the inability of people being not able to tell their own stories in their own words because of their surveillance and the constant crush of technology on humanity. I wonder if you had any ideas about that.
Well, again, so I had a specific thing I was researching. I was doing a project to be cited in a library, so I had to keep bringing my focus back to that. Mm-hmm. But the thing, though, what I kept encountering for myself was sort of shock. You don't really understand how many books are banned till you start looking at lists of banned books year by year, region by region. And it's daunting, books that you would, important books, really important books that have to do with us knowing who we are and our history, banned. But then also the way, I think that's something that has really come up in our politics increasingly since 2016, how knowledge and information is demonized, and anything that, this sort of idea that if it uncovers something that's uncomfortable, that perhaps we'd rather not know about, well, burn it or take it off the list or remove it from the library. Obviously that's not the solution. So, and I actually was thinking about the COVID app, right? About being vaccinated. And, that is really interesting because we're giving our permission to be watched, or these tracking apps that I know parents who have adolescent children want to know where their children are every minute of the breathing day. But that it's not only accessible to them, it's just daunting. Anyway. I have a question for Chris that I was curious about. So, because in your photo, I can't see the show, right? But those were actually letters that were stolen in the process of being sent from one, I mean, or were the living spaces broken into? I mean, that's actually, so it looked to me like stolen, contraband, but a different understanding of contraband. I mean, it's stolen personal items. So were those letters taken out of the mail?
So those letters particularly are kind of interesting because the person was incarcerated. And so his, I mean, as is typical for any incarcerated person, his letters were read, but more often than not, they were just fully confiscated so that he had no information about the outside world.
Right, so they were intercepted and never reached
Exactly. He
the
didn't get them until
intended
he got his
recipient.
files. Right. So
Yeah.
what was it? That was not, it must have been early 1950s. So yeah, 30 plus years that he read those letters later.
It is really interesting, I thought, the concept of, in the process of returning people's property to them, which is a good thing. But then in that process, the archive ceases, it just becomes atomized.
Right.
So that's sort of interesting.
Yeah, and it's counterintuitive because
Right.
even when I started the project, had a conception of, oh, well, how, like, what like justice, right? Like what transparency, that like, it's kind of radical. Like, here's your real file. We're not even going to mess with it, quote unquote, at least was the perception or the presentation. But then as I started to dig into the thing, you can't cross-reference it in a way that's productive for the way that, archival research or even artistic research works. So that's when it started to break down, and I had a lot of archivists talk about, how they lamented that particular decision and how that decision had political implications, which was, I thought, super interesting, and a kind of meditation on, and a good example to think about archives going forward, right? And think about how we're compiling stuff and the importance of the archive and the violence of the archive and all of that stuff.
Also thinking about this idea of privacy, that it ceases, our understanding of privacy ceases to exist under these conditions of surveillance. I was thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois, where the FBI, followed him basically from the 1950s to the 1950s, maybe, or I don't actually remember the date, but there was like, his file was like 600, and when what was made public when there was a FOIA request, like 650 pages of basically intercepted stories about intercepted phone calls, or the FBI was calling his house just to see who would answer the phone, sitting outside his house. And then through the FOIA request, it's like 99% redacted. And you just get these inklings. I mean, whenever you see a black redacted mass, you wonder, I mean, there's an implication actually that, not the implication that this is sensitive material protecting somebody, but the implication that they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. But, if you think about that surveillance of W.E.B. Du Bois went on for, I think, 40 years. And basically just, it was really part of destroying him,
Well, and something that's, I mean, I would recommend everybody to read is as Abram was mentioning, the Vault. It's very curated and sort of, washed of anything that's particularly juicy, if you will. But what you start to see is like how deliberate and how blatant these memos are. I mean, there's a memo that I use in my project that literally says, like, yeah, we need to know about their independence activities, but we need to know like information about spouses, like their hobbies, like the things that they're interested in. And then you literally see memos of their sort of psyops, right? They're like psychological operations where they would draft letters accusing leaders of infidelity, or write love letters posing as women and send them, there's the famous most famous case of this is obviously like MLK and the civil rights movement, but it happened everywhere, right? And it happened pervasively in Puerto Rico to the point where they would distribute pamphlets of cartoons that would create rifts between the political groups that were organizing for independence. And, you know, I think that that's, you know, that perception of it is super interesting. It just made me think about it, what you were mentioning about the redaction, you know, and how narrow the window is that we have a look into it.
I think I just want to also add just one thing, because you're talking about it as if in the past.
Right. No, very,
Okay.
yeah, super important to note, except we can't detect it now. And, you know, I think that's maybe why we're all interested in this, because there is a very contemporary concern.
Or it's become the like the fake news post-truth social media phenomenon. Or loads of the examples you just listed, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's Facebook. Or
I'm going to interject here. Thank you, everyone. I think we have time for one more question. A few came in from the audience. Maybe Brendan would like to pick one. And thanks everyone for hanging in on the audience side. This is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it if you need to leave before we're done tonight.
Okay, this question came from Sarah Ashkin, and I think it's a good one that, you know, all the panelists can relate to. And she asks, what is the role of the audience as a surveiller in your works, and how or how not is complicity a material for your practices?
Do you mean complicity or complacency?
I
didn't quite understand the question.
The former, not the latter. I'm sorry.
Well, I will say that when I was originally thinking about this work, one of the pieces I strongly considered, what it really started out is, can I articulate W.E.B. Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk as an endurance performance? So it's very interesting that you would bring that up. It was one of my impulses. And I really did want to explore, where do we think performance starts? And does it start because of the fact that you are being watched? Does your behavior, because your behavior is being interpreted over time, is it interpreted in a different way than you intended? So the people that were surveilling the performance in the original live performance, I really felt like they were my collaborators to help me answer these questions. And to be perfectly honest, just as a human being, I am deeply troubled by people who take stuff off of the internet and sort of claim it as their own. Take somebody else's narrative and claim it as their own. They saw a car crash, they saw somebody get shot in a window, they kind of replay it as their own entertainment. So I was really, really thinking about that in the original performance before it morphed into these other 3 iterations.
I would just say, just really briefly, just like on the line of complicity of, I don't know, seeing this tweet from the High File Vault Twitter account, which had never been following for something like a year, and it right before the election, it tweeted like 300 things in a day. Seeing this sort of call to witness, this question of who the audience is, and being asked by one's government to perform a certain kind of witness. It felt as much like a call to whiteness as a call to witnessing, to embody that distant view from above, that surveillance literally is, you know, the view from above. I felt tied into that, and don't have like a pithy answer to it, but that's where I started from, feeling complicit because of that.
I think for us, in the piece that's in this exhibition, it's in the text. So the text is very directly addressing the people who are witnessing the work and asking them to respond to questions in a way. And then also the questions kind of can be construed as being asking them. So you're not sure where the AI and the animal and the human are separated, or where, you know, there's a kind of morphing of that. And I think in the work that we're about to make, we're looking at actually implicating the viewer in the sense, in the viewers in the sense of the idea that the AI would be trained by an octopus and then might treat the humans as octopuses or something.
We're talking about the audience as participants with us in the experiment in that way. So maybe that's asking or looking for a different kind of relationship. Well, complicity sounds like a negative thing, maybe. We're more trying to think inclusive or different parameters of between audience and artists curating the experience, like to shift, make that more of a co-designed experience or something. I don't know. In that second piece that doesn't exist yet.
Thank you, everyone. Whoops, go ahead. Yeah.
No, well, I was just thinking I'd like to address my complacency. Because, you know, through all the research, I've done a number of, I guess, research-based projects, one on the disasters of war at the library, where I'm compiling a lot of information that I have very strong opinions about, but I'm not actually doing anything. I'm compiling information and I put it together and I put it out there. But, you know, I think coming out of a period where I had considered myself an artist activist, I don't actually think that it's activism. I think I've sort of turned into a researcher, archivist, maybe. But in a way, and so I question, you know, the complacency of that. So I think it's something I'm good at. I'm certainly more comfortable. I am actually more comfortable looking at a computer and putting information together than going out to the street and organizing. I don't know why that is.
They're both forms of unveiling or pushing different kinds of lens onto stuff. I don't know. Maybe, like, do you feel like that's a problem that you don't engage on the street?
I know Julie wanted to end us, but it's not ending. I think that I started doing the research because I felt useless on the street. I wasn't sure that anything I could offer was unusual or using what I felt were particular skills that I have. And so maybe now I've come to this other way of thinking after spending all this time doing what I think I'm good at. Maybe I have a different type of longing.
I might jump in, Anne, and say that today we had a big group of students in, and of course for them, library surveillance was a newish topic for most of them. And your compilation, they all walked out with their own copy and started reading it in the gallery. And I think, you know, in terms of actions taken or how the work operates in the world, as artists, we often don't know what it does. But I think for even that example just today with a group of students, there's ways in which the work operates in the world to transform our thinking about these issues, to complicate our understandings or amplify them in some way that I think is really exciting for the work. So it's great, I think, I'll keep sharing with you when people respond to the works. Also to know how people are understanding the works in the gallery for all of you. It's an exciting project. We've had lots of groups of students through and lots of public as well. So I am going to wrap up because I think we initially said we'd finish at 7:30. So I want to thank everyone, all the artists and Brendan, your really well-researched, articulated questions and the thought and answering them from everyone on the panel. It's an incredible conversation, and it's really great to have you all here together in the Zoom room. And thanks so much to all the audience for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank
Thanks,
you.
Julie, Brendan,
Right,
and
thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.